We've talked a lot about Wicked, which, is a generational achievement in conversation for greatest of all time in its medium. You don't get a lot of those. What does it feel like to be the guy who produced one of the most successful, longest-running, beloved musicals of all time?
Feels pretty good. It's very gratifying. Wicked is something I loved from the beginning, as you know, because you were a young kid, and I'd come home from readings and put on tapes in the car.
I was at those readings when I was like, freshman of high school.
Yeah, I love what the story was about. It's very interesting, but that was early in my producing career, and I always felt very strongly that it was an extension of my Jewishness, that story. It's about tolerance. It's about being another. Its metaphor is about a leader coming in and blaming the underrepresented for the ills of society. Mm-hmm. And this was written 20-some years ago.
Right.
With the metaphor in Wicked being the animal culture and animals being silenced. And the writers look back at history and a lot at the Holocaust. And we talked about the Holocaust a lot. And the fascism in Germany and how that came to be when we were creating Wicked. It's what Gregory Maguire was doing in his novel.
Right.
It's only as history keeps repeating itself over and over that if you went to see the film or the musical Wicked today, you might think it was written about the world we live in today.
I think that's part of what's made it so successful.
I always felt it was about doing good, repairing the world, speaking truth to power when it's not popular, standing up and saying this is what's right and this is what's wrong. Again, these to me were all Jewish values. Mm-hmm. It's about the social construct that is evil or prejudice. You can be anything in Oz. You can be differently abled. You can be big, tall, small. You just can't be green. And it's completely arbitrary on purpose because the nature of prejudice is a social construct. Society somehow creates you're different and therefore you're less than somehow. I cared so much about it. You can never predict when something's going to become a phenomenon. Sure. Anybody who says that, I don't see it. I thought it was going to be a good entertainment, and I thought it would have a nice run initially. But the fact that it became embraced by generations isn't something I accounted for. I don't think about it that much because, I don't know, I never read my press, so to speak. But it's a very satisfying feeling to know that something you spend so much time on and that so much of what's inside you is in those characters and that story is so embraced by the world and that people's lives have been changed, hopefully, for the better and for good for having that experience, either in the theater or in the film.
Yeah. There's a line in Wicked that I think about a lot and have been thinking about a lot actually since October 7th, speaking of the timelessness of it. The truth is not a thing of fact or reason. The truth is just what everyone agrees on. Very prescient, kind of timeless words. When you hear that in the context of today, where does your head go?
Just how incredibly and sadly relevant that is. As part of why we're in such a conundrum, why there is so much hatred and extremism. People will believe what they want to believe. They don't want to stop believing what they want to believe in. And we're programmed now to live in echo chambers, so we can only hear what we want to hear. And it seems to me that truth died a long time ago.
What responsibility, if any, do you feel that Jewish industry leaders have in terms of speaking out against Jew hate and in support of Israel?
I think all of us have a responsibility to stand up for our community, like any other community that receives hate has to stand up. Because one of the things we've learned really since October 7th is if we don't do it, nobody else will. And of course, there's some incredible exceptions to that, which is why we covet and look to our allies with such great appreciation and such respect these days. But I think all of us, in whatever position we're in, have a responsibility to speak up. Now, we may do it in different ways. Some may do it publicly, some may do it privately, but we all have an obligation to right the wrong, like we would for any other community and have for other communities for so long.
You're somebody who prefers the private route for the most part. What's the calculus for you in that strategy?
I'll characterize that. For many years, my participation in the Federation was as a speaker, and I would travel the country and speak to fundraising events who wanted to hear about Hollywood. But what I would discuss with them, often discuss Wicked, the Broadway musical, and the values in that, and what it was to be Jewish in Hollywood, et cetera, et cetera. In the world we're living in now, I find, particularly with social media, my style and my effectiveness is, because I'm not on social media. I'm not someone who's posting, or I'm not a politician. I'm not going to speak at a, political event. But when I see someone speak in a way that feels terribly misinformed to me, I have found it to be most effective to reach out directly to that person and say, can I sit down with you? Would you have a conversation with me? You posted something, you said something, and I'd like to present to you the other side. Or I feel it's, seriously misinformed. And I've had some great success there. I mean, one never knows for sure, but I feel like I've had great impact one-on-one. I've been invited into people's homes thereafter. I know some of the work that individuals have done who have posted some things that I have found upsetting. And I've had some not successful encounters where I've tried my best, but the individual's coming from a place of what feels to me just like hate and Jew hate, period.
Have you felt the silence from some of your peers or your colleagues in the industry in the past 18 months?
Without question. I think one of the most disappointing, one of the most upsetting aspects since October 7th has been the silence or even abandonment of others, of my colleagues, who have either gone quiet or abandoned me. When I, again, talking about being public, when the October 7th first occurred, I set up a series of Zooms from different communities. One was a sports Zoom, one was a Hollywood Zoom. I had Gal Gadot and Sacha Baron Cohen on it, and we talked to Jews and non-Jews alike about what was going on, the hostages, et cetera, et cetera. But there were some communities where I tried to organize that, again, for purposes of educating and saying, here's the other side. Let's just walk through both sides of it, where there wasn't an interest in engaging.
Would you say that sort of came more from non-Jewish colleagues, Jewish colleagues, or
I'd say mostly, even? I would say mostly non-Jewish colleagues, but some Jewish colleagues too.
That's got to be tough.
It's very tough. It's almost like you don't want to know everything about somebody, because once you do, you can't erase it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the projects I was in the middle of since October 7th, I was cautious about, not about myself, but about not soliciting other people's points of view in a way that would make it impossible for me to continue working when I was in the middle of something.
Right.
But I'm very, I read everything, and I get a lot of incoming. If there's people upset in the Jewish community in Hollywood will call me about this person, that person. And what I do have, like everybody else has, is choice to choose who I work with, who I engage with.
Several members of the Wicked cast, including Ariana Grande, Cynthia Erivo, Bowen Yang, have been active, at least online, in their opposition to Israel, Artists for a Ceasefire. As someone who cares so much about your professional relationships and the product you're making on set, how do you navigate that?
I talk to people, and I think, particularly in those instances, people are told that something is about something in a very reductive way, and it feels like, well, who doesn't care about innocent tragedy, innocent civilians? No decent human being wants any suffering in humanity from decent people. What happens in instances is individuals ascribe their names to something where they're not being completely informed, and the messaging to them is they're suffering here.
Right.
We have to speak out for suffering. The message doesn't include there's also suffering over here, or there's suffering that was prompted or instigated by an act of terror or an act of evil, or there's a terrorist group in place that wishes for the annihilation of a whole group of people. That gets left out of the conversation. And so my way of dealing is when the moment is right, is to have that conversation where it can be heard.
Right.
And where what I'm saying can be heard not in the midst of anger, and because the people you reference aren't those people. They're
Sure.
but where it can be heard and processed and therefore understood. And I feel good about those conversations that have been had.
Do you have any feelings one way or the other about Jewish representation in film? Has that ever been something that's been crossed your mind?
It's crossed my mind a lot years ago. I feel like there is I think there has been increasing amounts of Jewish representation in film and television, but there's different kinds of representation. So I believe there are a lot of Jewish folks working in Hollywood.
Right.
Are there a lot of Jewish stories? Probably not enough. Should they be considered stories that are worthy as from an underrepresented group? They should be,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But I also believe that art is empathy. And one of the things lacking in our world is empathy, because we are living in these corridors, these echo chambers. And while I think that the ability to identify with your community is very significant and important, and to feel represented is very important, and to feel you belong and to be seen is very important, I also believe that without empathy, this world will be even worse shape than it's in now. The ability to step into someone else's shoes and feel what they're feeling is what makes an artist, whether you're a painter, sculptor, an actor, a writer, or director. Do I believe that every character that's Jewish in film or TV needs to be played by a Jewish actor? I don't.
Mm-hmm.
Like I believe there are plenty of Jewish actors who can play non-Jewish roles, and I want them to get those roles. For me, again, someone who tries to live in the center, where I draw the line is if the story is about being Jewish, queer, if it's about being queer, that's the essential ingredient of the story, then I feel like representation is even more significant, and that it wants to be portrayed or directed or written by someone from that community. But I also, that's what I mean by living in the center. So,
Right.
There are many people who influence a story, actors, writers, directors, producers. So I like there to be representation, but I don't believe it has to be singular
Yeah.
in a subject matter. I think it's dangerous when it is.
I think that's fair.